Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Turfgrass Epistemology. I'm Travis Shaddix. Thank you for joining me. We had no intro today. I was running a little late. My technological incompetence reared its ugly head again. But I'm pretty sure it's working. so thank you all for showing up and attending today. We've been going over fall fertility of cool season grasses for about 2 or 3 weeks now. We've gone over some older papers, and we're working our way up to more current papers. And most of the papers we've been talking about talk about what happens to the turf in terms of response or quality as nitrogen's applied in September, October, November, or whatever. And a lot of those papers show some beneficial responses. But there are some other concerns that we need to be aware of. So I called someone who's much more intelligent and knowledgeable in this area than myself to come on and explain one of his papers to me. And that person, of course, is Mr. Doug Soldat. How are you, Doug?
Doing well, Travis. I'm not sure that I can own up to that intro, but do my best.
Well, my original intro was probably more embarrassing for you, so I chose to go with this one. I place you in the top 5 easily of current active turfgrass soil scientists. I know that sort of might not be fair to some people.
Yeah, there's about 5 of us. So
no, there's not. Come on. I mean, your mentor and Marty and Carl, and there's some people that are more emeritus now and sort of phasing into retirement. And of course, Beth's still around, but she's sort of phased into another area. And so you're definitely, in my mind, quite high. If you really want to know the true value of yourself, don't ask, what do you think of yourself? Ask, what do your peers think of you? And I would struggle to find one of my peers that would not place you in the very top of the list for turfgrass soil scientists. So that's
very kind.
That's my position. I'm sticking to it. So, so Doug, tell us a little bit about yourself. I know you had a little bit of I don't know if it's a change, but you had a little bit of movement in your position, and I don't know if you care to talk about that, but just kind of give everybody a bird's eye view of Doug Soldat and what you're doing nowadays.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'm a turfgrass extension specialist at the University of Wisconsin. 60% extension appointment. I also teach. I have a 15% teaching appointment. So I just finished teaching our introductory soil science class. I also advise the turfgrass management students here at UW Madison, and I teach a class in cool season turfgrass fertility and water management. So I guess within the last year, I became the chair of the soil science department here at University of Wisconsin, and so that's been a bit of a learning curve and trying to figure out how I can do my part to help manage the department, but also keep my program going.
Yeah,
starting to figure that out over the last few months. So definitely enjoying the change, but want to still remain committed to turfgrass research while I'm doing it.
So So you're still keeping the production that you've had over the years up, and even moving into a chair. You're trying your best to keep it running with things like graduate students.
Yeah, that's the goal.
Projects.
I mean, that's the goal. I got a wonderful staff. I have a research technician who has been with me for many years, who's outstanding, Nick Barrow, and I have a couple good grad students, which helps. I have a postdoc, so there's a lot of people that help keep the ship moving. But yeah, that's the goal, is to be able to maintain an active research program while also serving as the chair.
I always get a kick out of reading like older papers where, I'm not saying this is necessarily true, but when I see older papers with like sole authorships, and I'm not knocking those people, I'm just saying that when I see sole author papers of robust studies, I always think to myself, I don't think there's any way they did all that work by themselves, And so it's always good to see, or to know, for other people to realize the amount of resources and labor required, to get these projects done. Staff, especially if you have a really good laboratory staff or field staff, or your graduate students. I mean, shoulder a lot of the weight. And so when I see these older papers with sole authorships, I'm thinking, I don't know about that. Did you really do all that work by yourself? There's usually a lot of people involved. So that's what it sounds like you had as well. So that's good to see. So if you heard my preamble, for about I'm trying to get out of cool season fertility, but there's so many papers, it seems like it's endless. And I just like, I'll just keep going into cool season fertility and fall fertility until at some point I imagine I'll reach the end. But I still have 8 or 9 more papers lined up, and I think I've done, I don't know, 6, 7 already. I don't know. But we've covered, just to give you a heads up of what we've gone over, we've covered like some of the early papers, like Carroll's 39 paper, Carroll's 43 paper, some of the early papers that showed that there might be some issues with fall fertility on cool season grasses in terms of winter hardiness, where they were doing things in the greenhouse or freezing them in the lab and doing things like that. Then we covered Powell's paper in 67, both of his papers in 67, where he was doing things in the field with bent and fescue, as opposed to just strictly greenhouse and I don't say artificial freezing, but not necessarily in the field. And he did his in the field, and so we're not seeing a lot of the damage that have previously been reported. And so since then, and it's just my understanding, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but since Powell studies, it seems like fall fertility has really taken on much more of a role in our management of our fertility. And we haven't quite got to the environmental consequences or other unintended consequences of these applications. We're talking about the benefits to the turf. And so we're starting to kind of get to the point where it's like, okay, yeah, there's some benefits, but we need to be aware of these other things. And we need to be aware of what is, potentially a more efficient way to apply these nutrients to cool season turf grasses in the fall. And that's when we come to the Lloyd paper that we're going to discuss today. So with that, the paper that we're going to discuss today is your Hort Science paper in 2011. So this will be open access to everybody if you didn't already know. Is that low temperature nitrogen uptake and use of 3 cool season turf grasses under controlled environments. Now, there's about 35 of your papers that I would like to go over with you at some point. So why did I choose this one? It just happened to be the one of the topic that I've been going over. But there's obviously a slew of other papers that probably more people are probably more aware of than this paper. But I think this is a paper that is relevant and pertinent to what we're talking about. Can you just perhaps give us a bird's eye view of what the project, how did it start, whether it was a grad student project, and what sort of questions you were going over, and basically kind of go through the introduction of the paper with us from your recollection of those times when you started the project.
Yeah, absolutely. So like you talked about in the intro, a lot of the work gets done by a host of people, and this project was mostly executed by Dan Lloyd, who is now golf course superintendent at St. Albans Country Club around St. Louis, Missouri. And when this was published, he was actually working as a research technician at the University of Missouri. I like this paper because it was the first project that I started as a assistant professor at Wisconsin. So when I was hired, they give you some startup money, and and that's some of the money that helped me hire Dan, who was an undergrad in our program at the University of Wisconsin at the time, and president of the Turf Club and ambitious. And I said, well, hey, would you be interested in coming to grad school? He said, yeah, absolutely. And I've been thinking about this for a while while I was in graduate school. Is like, you always heard, the best time to fertilize, you put out these high rates of soluble fertilizer around the time of Halloween. And that's just something that you did. And of course, when you're taking turfgrass management classes, you don't really question why or where that information came from. You just say, okay, that's the best time. You get into grad school and you start to dig in, and you start to say, oh, why, or where did this information come from? And so that's what I was doing. Is I was thinking, well, how can I contribute to the science? How can I advance it? And I was really skeptical, or became skeptical of this idea that we should be putting out high levels of soluble nitrogen when the grass stops growing. And that idea, that skepticism came from my master's advisor, Wayne Cousseau, who developed this, or kind of framed turfgrass fertility in the concept of nutrient demand, is that grass growth is what governs the demand for nutrients. And so if your grass is growing really rapidly, it's got a high demand for nutrients. If it's not growing rapidly, then the nutrient demand is low. And so this kind of flew in the face of that. And so I went back and kind of looked at all the work that had been done and found that there hadn't been a lot of work that was done like this. And ironically, when I proposed this project, the Wisconsin Golf Course Superintendents Association initially was like, no, this isn't cutting edge enough. We already know that fall is a great time to fertilize. And I said, just give me a chance. I don't think we know as much as we think we do. And so we did this study in a couple different ways. The paper we'll talk about today was the greenhouse study, or the growth chamber study, where we controlled all the conditions carefully. And then we also did a very similar version of this in the field at University of Minnesota. It was a collaboration with Sam Bauer and Brian Horgan, both at University of Minnesota at the time. So we did that in the field in Minnesota and down here in Madison.
Yeah, I have the Bauer paper. I think I might have went over the Bauer paper. I don't recall. I'll have to go back and look. I have a folder with those things in it. So if we haven't gone over that paper, then it's on my list somewhere, I'm sure. So this is the greenhouse study, and I've mentioned in the past, sort of. I mean, you may have a different opinion, but sort of how some turfgrass science works, where we might start in the lab with a certain project and then move to the greenhouse and then move to the field, primarily due to the expenses and cost of doing large treatment, designs. We can't go to the field with 45 treatments, it's just too expensive. It's not easy to do that, as opposed to doing small things. So to go from the greenhouse, like apparently, this is what you did here, yes, and then go to the field with another project is pretty common. I think we've kind of covered that to some degree, so my audience should be fairly familiar with that. Now, we've also gone over differences between those two environments. So what we find in the greenhouse is not always what we find in the field. Sometimes it is what we find in the field, but we have to be cautious how we frame those conclusions, based upon the environment that the study was conducted in. So with that, let's talk about this. That was the introduction, sort of why you did it, how you did it. I'm going to briefly just mention the objectives of the study. At the end of the introduction, there's usually the objectives, and it's over here. The objective of the study was to evaluate an N-uptake potential, use, and plant metabolic responses in a climate-controlled environment, evaluating the responses of cool season turfgrass species to various nitrogen rates and temperature regimes. So that was the hypothesis, the objective of the study. You want to just briefly there's two or three, this isn't an extremely long paper. There's 2 or 3 tables. There's one really important figure. So we do have some time, but you want to just briefly kind of explain what you did and how you did it, or has it been too many years, or you want me to go through it?
Yeah, it's been a few years now, but I think I can do a pretty good job of this. So We've been saying greenhouse, but these were actually growth chambers, which are just like greenhouses on steroids. They actually they don't allow any natural light in through glass panels. It's like a completely sealed chamber with very intense lights, very high climate control, so temperature, photo period. I mean, it's just like you control everything. And like you said, we do things in the field, we do things in greenhouses, we do things in growth chambers for different reasons. And part of the reason we wanted to be in the growth chamber for this is that we're looking at the impact of temperature on nitrogen uptake. And a fall can be really weird. You can have like really weird cold fronts and heat stretches. And so then if you're trying to say, well, on average, what is fall like? What is October 15th like in Madison on average? Mm-hmm. We kind of know what that is like, right? You probably need a light jacket. Temperatures are probably in the 50s. But any given fall, it could be 85 degrees or it could snow
Yeah.
on October 15th. So these temperatures that we used in the growth chamber were the 30-year averages for the photo period, of course, which doesn't change, but for the temperature, importantly. So we took 3 grasses, the most common grasses in Wisconsin: Kentucky bluegrass. We used Midnight, which is a turfgrass elite variety, Pencross creeping bentgrass, and then True Putt annual bluegrass, which is commercially available cultivar. We grew them into these controlled conditions. At first, we grew them all under like optimal conditions in an actual greenhouse just to get them established. And we grew them in these 4-inch PVC pots that were filled with USGA root zone mix.
Okay.
Again, just to minimize variation. And so then, after they were sort of grown in, we would move them into these growth chambers where we would control the temperatures. And it was either mid-September, mid-October, or mid-November averages.
Yeah.
And then after about a week or so, we'd go in there and fertilize them with 15N labeled nitrogen. And that's important because then when we harvest the grass or the roots, the shoots or whatever, we can look specifically for the 15N label, which tells us that nitrogen came from the fertilizer. It didn't come from the soil, didn't come from anywhere else. It's just if it was 15N in the leaf, that 15N came from the fertilizer that we added. Because normally nitrogen has an atomic mass of 14. So this has got an extra neutron in it. It's heavier, and we got fancy equipment that can trace it. So then we use 3 different fertilization rates. So basically a half a pound of nitrogen, a pound, and then we went to the extreme rate of 2 pounds. So that was kind of our range. And a lot of times that's how you'll do an experimental design, is you want to bracket what's possible. And is it possible that somebody puts 2 pounds of soluble nitrogen out? Probably not. I mean, sure, maybe by accident or an overlap strip, but in my mind, the real range here is 0. Some people don't fertilize at all in the late fall, and some people might put up to a pound. But we threw that 2 pounds in there just to make sure we're covering our bases.
Yeah, I've mentioned that to the audience before about like, don't do what Pal did. I mean, he put out 10 pounds, 2 pounds every month. But we do those things so that we know we have to have a range of nitrogen rates such that more than likely the most efficient rate is from the low to the high that we've chosen, right? So we to some degree with nitrogen it's a little different, but to some degree we're kind of making our best estimate guess as to what the range probably will be, and then we have to have a couple points above that and a couple points below that. And so when you see these high rates, I've tried to do my due diligence to let people know that the rate was in here, 2 pounds. I think it wasn't Pal, it was somebody else. I can't remember who it was. I don't know if it was Carol or somebody else. They were, doing these 8, 10, 12 pound nitrogen rates. And I say, don't do that. Okay. Just because they did it and they show a response doesn't mean you're supposed to do it. The response they're looking for is the acceptable response from the lowest in rate. And it wasn't the high rate. It's usually much, much lower than the high rate that they've chosen. So there is a rationale behind these very high rates in research, but it's research. It's not what you would recommend necessarily.
Yeah, but also, so that's part of the justification for why we did this, is because if you look at the Powell paper, they show you get like enhanced root growth at high rates of fall fertilization. But those high rates, like you said, are like 4, 6, 8 pounds is when they start to see those root differences. And it's like, if you look down at the rates that folks in Wisconsin are using in modern times, you don't see a root growth effect. And so what we're saying is, like, sometimes, science gets translated and there's information lost in the translation. And I think that's a really good example of something being lost in the translation. So it could happen for this paper. Somebody could focus on something that we saw in the high rate and use that for a justification, when if you're not applying that high rate, it's just not relevant to you. So, 3 out of the 4 nitrogen rates that we used in this study, I think, are relevant, and that one high rate is probably of scientific interest, but not of practical interest.
Yeah, you said that very well. Yeah, and that's sort of one of the hopes, or the objectives of this whole channel, is to, have a conversation about this so that it's not misinterpreted perhaps as frequently as it has been in the past. A lot of what I'll publish, I'll see it somewhere and I'm like, oh, that's great. You guys picked it up. And then I'll see it somewhere else. I'm like, why are you guys doing that? Well, you published it. I'm like, well, hold on. You misunderstood. That's what was in there, but they interpreted it beyond the boundaries of what I did. And it's not exactly what wasn't the intent. So hopefully we're here to clear some of this up. If we, hopefully, it's just less misinformation or less misinterpretation, I should say, of some of the numbers and some of the results. So that's basically what you did. And then you took I believe it was this paper, you took the columns and you split them in half, right? And you harvested all the plant tissue above the soil, basically, and all the tissue below the soil. And that's how you partitioned it? Right. Is that the case?
That is right. Yep.
So, and then we measured, you guys measured the nitrogen that was in the top portion of the plant, and I think it's in here somewhere. And then here it is. Verdure from each column was removed at the soil surface. And then basically what happens, if I understand correctly, you split the column with a saw or something, and you took half of it and you measured the verdure and the roots from that half. And then the other half, what did you do with the other half? I forgot.
Well, I think we measured the entire verdure, so we just cut off the tops, and
soil
then
analysis.
We split the soil in half because half, we needed to get the roots out of it. So we had to have some way, because you can't do both. Like, if you're to analyze the soil, you can't clean the roots out, because then that soil gets washed away. So you basically split them in half. One half was used to get the root mass, and then we doubled that. And then the other half was used for standard soil analyses. Yeah.
So one point in here I wanted to make sure that I asked you about is, and so that the audience understands why you did this, is that the columns were maintained, they were managed, they were cut, and everything looks fine. They moved them to a growth chamber. And when you ended up applying the nitrogen, it says right here, all plants were cut at 13 millimeters and allowed to grow unclipped until harvested. So then plants were watered 3 times weekly, 80% of the pot holding capacity to prevent more moisture. Plants were destructively harvested 10 days after the N15 treatment. So you applied the N15 in a solution, a liquid solution right here. And then you didn't cut anything. You didn't remove any tissue or any turf grass. I'm saying this, it's really more of a question. You didn't remove any turf grass. You waited for 10 days for the turf grass to assimilate or metabolize any of the nitrogen that was applied, and then you basically ended the study, cut them in half, removed the tissue, and determined the nitrogen uptake after 10 days. That's the case?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. Is there a reason why 10 days was chosen rather than, say, a year?
We're kind of thinking it's not going to be mid-September for very long. So at some point, these growth chambers aren't moving, they're not getting colder as the year goes on, so it's just like a snapshot in time. So we're like, if the grass is growing in these mid-September, which is basically optimum for cool season grass growth, there's not a better time on earth in Madison than mid-September for growing grass. That's the optimum time. It's not going to be optimum forever. It will be optimum for 10 days, probably. So we wanted to make sure that the nitrogen uptake and metabolization was representative of that temperature, and that could occur, right? So it's just like that snapshot.
Unless you have something to go over on the NOVA table, I'm going to skip it because I'm trying to keep things more like layman sort of terminology. But if you want to go over the NOVA, feel free. I don't know.
It works with me.
Okay, I was going to say we might lose some people on the NOVA table, but it's here if anybody wants to watch. Well, I'm not claiming I would understand it myself, but so let's go to the results. So the results, you have the results broken out essentially. The verdure, what was taken up in the above soil, it's called everything above the soil. What was taken up in everything below the soil, and then you have, well, I should say, that you have a graph for that, but you also have the growth rate or the amount of material that was in the verdure and the roots as well. Now, the one thing I can't zoom in on this table, so I'm not sure if you can see it on your screen, Doug, or not, but it took me a little while, and this, I'm just saying I'm pleading ignorance on this. It took me a little while to figure out what exactly was going on in the statistics in this table because I hadn't seen statistics like this. And so I want to ask you a question to make sure that I'm understanding it correctly. Normally, when we see tables like this, we're either running differences vertically or horizontally through a column or through a row. But I think this is the case within all of this run one. The A is being compared to all the other numbers, regardless of what row or column it's in. Is that true?
Yeah, that is right. And you're right. Usually we do them within columns, but we were actually you can run stats in a bunch of different ways and display them different ways. But
Okay.
in this case, you're right. Within runs, all those letters are relevant.
Okay. So the 0 nitrogen in September is being compared to all other nitrogens in all other months. Right. And so what the the biomass above ground, there really wasn't a whole lot that happened difference wise when you get to October and November. All of them were basically the same regardless of the nitrogen rate that was applied. The one that stood out really from the rest was the 2-pound application in September resulted in greater biomass verdure than any other nitrogen rate applied at any other month in both runs. Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah. And I mean, that basically just says like turfgrass, and these are all the grasses combined together, are nitrogen pigs. Mm-hmm. And if you give lots of nitrogen to grasses in perfect growing conditions, they're going to use it. And that's really what we're seeing. So you definitely, if you look across you just look at the run 1, run 2, September, you just kind of go left to right. You see that basically the more nitrogen you put down, the more biomass you get. And it doesn't stop. You go up to 2 pounds, you're going to grow way more, so the nitrogen utilization is very high in these grasses. Yeah.
So and we don't have quality in this paper, and that's fine. We have biomass and uptake, but I'm glad you worded it the way you worded it, because I want to make sure that we're clear to the audience, and I want to make sure I'm not misrepresenting what you found. When 0 all the way up to 2 pounds of nitrogen was applied in September, we see a consistent increase from 0 in to a quarter pound to half a pound to 1 pound to 2 pounds. We see the increase in growth. But when we get to October and November, those don't occur. It stops. Right. So, and I know there's some literature here and there that talks about, well, we're going to build carbohydrate reserves, and I don't think that ground's not. That ice isn't very thick to stand on, I don't think. But there's some little bit here and there. You'll see some hints of underground roots and some continued growth in the absence of a tremendous amount of photosynthesis. You'll see a little bit. Every now and then you'll find a paper. But for the most part, and we're going to talk about another paper on Wednesday that Eric did over in Washington that has quality in it, and his results were pretty much the same as yours. Where, am I correct in saying applications of nitrogen in the fall, if they're secluded to September, will result more than likely in a turfgrass response, as opposed to October, November, where in the fall, where the nitrogen application in October, November in that fall isn't going to really give you anywhere near the magnitude of response, because it's just simply getting colder and the light's getting lower. Is that fair to say?
It's true if you added the word growth response, because we did, and we didn't, I don't think we measured it in this study, but in the field, when we basically duplicated this, we see color responses in October, but not growth responses.
Oh, yes.
And in November, we see a little bit of color and no growth. So there's a lag period where color responses will be active, but growth responses won't.
And that is consistent.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to overspeak, but yeah, that's consistent. Even I think it was Powell's paper. I have to go back and look, but there are several papers that show a color increase, but without a growth increase from these applications in October and November. So
yeah, and that's the whole foundation for why fall nitrogen seems like a great idea, is that if you're where is that color coming from? It's coming from more chlorophyll. And what does that mean? It means you have more photosynthesis, but you're not putting it into your shoots. So where do you put it? Maybe you put it into your roots. Maybe you store it away. And so that's the whole, theoretical idea behind fertilizing in October and November, when you're not going to get a growth response, but you may get a color response. So that's really what we're testing here.
Okay. So on that note, you frame things more succinctly than I do. Maybe I should take a lesson and learn from that. But so I'm going to skip over table 4, but if you want to talk about it, let me, this has to do with simply species differences, and that's fine. But I want to talk about what you just mentioned is the root biomass effect. So the idea is that the nitrogen being applied in the fall might not result in a growth response after September, but it's likely to result in a color response, meaning there's photosynthesis occurring or likely occurring. Where is that energy going? As you mentioned, it could be going to the roots. But did you find that? Is the question. Did you find an increase in root biomass?
It doesn't look like it. So roots are notoriously difficult to study, and I try to avoid doing root work whenever possible, because you need huge differences in root mass to start to see differences. Now, here's the problem. We only had 10 days of growth. How much can root mass really change in 10 days? It's not like, there's resistance to root growth because you have soil in the way. So that's the caveat here, is that this is root biomass. Biomass probably wouldn't change much in 10 days. No, we don't. If you look across those statistics, we're not seeing an increase in root growth as the rates go up. If anything, where we do see statistical differences, it's sometimes in the opposite direction. We see less roots in run 1. Run 2, we don't see anything at all. So
granted, it's 10 days. You're right.
Yeah. No, I'll say again, we're not talking about the other work, but in the field, we do get increases in root growth, but it's only based on temperature. So not related to the nitrogen rate. So as the season gets colder, we see increases in biomass.
I want to make sure I'm not missing that. What was the year of that paper, the field study? I may have already covered it. Do you remember the year of the field study paper? Who was the main author? Who was the first author?
I think that was in the Bauer work. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I covered it, but I'll go back and check, make sure I'm not missing it. I know I'd covered let me look. I have a folder of all the ones I've already done. No, 2012 agronomic and physiological response. Oh, well, that's the review paper. There's a
review paper.
Yeah. This is the review paper, right? Yeah, yep. That's the review paper. So that's not the one you're talking about. You're talking about a different one.
Yeah, the field. And honestly, I'm not even sure.
I'll look it up.
Where it's published, if it's published, or it's just in the thesis. So
well, on that note, we're about to talk about percent uptake, and I thought either at an ASA meeting or somewhere, I don't know if it was in some periodical, but I thought you actually, because we're going to look at nitrogen uptake just in the fall here, but I thought you did nitrogen uptake too from those applications later in the spring. Am I
in the field?
In the field. Okay, so I'm getting them confused. The two studies confused. Okay, so let's continue. Basically, the growth rate of the above ground tissue didn't change in October, the October and November temperature and light regimes. It did increase. The nitrogen did increase it when it was applied under the September conditions. I guess that's the fair way to say it. The root growth didn't change much at all in run 2 under any of the nitrogen rates or the monthly conditions. In the first run, there was probably there was an increase. Later there's a little bit of difference. No, there's not one there. There's a little bit of difference over here from the 1 and 2 pound rates applied in November compared to the 1 and 2 pounds rate applied in September. So there's a little bit going on there, but we didn't see, it wasn't consistent across runs. So that's the growth. Okay. I'm going to skip ahead to this graph, because really this graph tells everything that we need to know about the uptake of the nitrogen itself, the N15 labeled uptake, right? And I don't mean to skip over anything that you want to cover if I'm missing something, Doug, but just tell me to go backwards. But this is the N15 uptake as the total N in the roots. You want to kind of go over this for us? What happened?
Yeah, absolutely. So this, and I agree with you, Travis, this is where the majority of the paper, if I could explain the paper in one figure, this would be it. So this is the special labeled nitrogen. So we know, if we put down 100% of the stuff, and then we're saying how much of it we recovered in the roots and in the shoots. So what's not we didn't leach anything out. So where's the rest of it? The rest of it's in the soil. So we watered these plants so that no drainage came out the bottom. So all the nitrogen is in those columns. That again, another reason to do a study like this is you can be you can control it. So in 10 days, that nitrogen had a chance to get into the shoot, get into the root. Obviously, all got into the roots. That's where it got taken up. And then it got reallocated to different parts of the plant. Or it could just sit in the soil, stay in the soil. So that's...
May I interject just a second, Doug?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
May I interject just 1 second? So let's go back to the material. So you applied this as a liquid, and then there's a couple different ways to do that. When it was applied as a liquid, was it immediately watered into the soil, or was allowed to remain on the leaf?
It was applied in a liquid volume, like it wasn't sprayed, like with a high pressure.
It wasn't sprayed, so it was like maybe a little injector thing or something you put on the soil or the leaf. Okay.
Yeah, it was dissolved in an amount of water. I don't remember if
they have those little,
but
I forget what it was. They have those little 10 milliliter aliquot pipette or things that sometimes I've used. I don't know but you're avoiding the leaf surface itself.
We watered it in. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We applied it in high level of water volume so that it was in the root zone, but not causing drainage. So
and the N15, the N15 source what was the N source? I forgot. Did I mention that at the beginning? Ammonium sulfate. Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to divert your direction. Go ahead. Please continue. Ammonium sulfate applied to the soil.
Right. So then now 10 days later, we harvest the roots, we harvest the shoots, and we we process the samples and get them analyzed for 15N. And so the black bars are the nitrogen that we found in the roots. And let's just start there. And this was, again, root work is frustrating. And we actually see the exact opposite trend, which is why we do these growth chamber and greenhouse experiments. The Crop Science Society of America recommends doing at least 2 runs, preferably more. And this is a good example of why you do that. You see that we see an increase in root recovery as temperatures cool for run 1. And in run 2, we saw a decrease in recovery as the temperature decreased. So those are literally showing us the opposite. Now the September-October recoveries look about the same, but there's huge differences in November nitrogen recovery, which makes me want to do this again. And of course, we would have done it again if we knew this was going to be the result. We would have loved to have a run 3 and 4.
Yeah.
And so to any budding researchers out there, this is a part of the paper where we've left questions unanswered.
Yeah.
But in general, what you're seeing is that of the nitrogen we applied, not much of it gets into the roots, with the exception of the November in run 1, which is kind of canceled out by what we found in November run 2. But generally about 20% or less, 10 to 20%. And when you look at the white bars now, the portion that's white is basically the nitrogen that's in the verdure, including the clippings. So anything that's not a root, you can see contains the majority of nitrogen. And the main finding there is as you drop in temperature, you decrease the total recovery. So more is left hanging around in the soil. And if we just focus on the November, let's look at the middle. The middle is the 1 pound per 1,000 application rate.
Mm-hmm.
You can see that in the first run, you're seeing a pretty substantial decrease in nitrogen recovery in October and November, which appear to be equal. And then when you move to run 2, you're kind of seeing September and October, you actually kind of see almost a linear trend in decrease.
Mm-hmm.
But September and October are closer, and then you get a bigger drop off in November, like a huge drop off, like less than half of the amount of nitrogen we were able to recover. So it's definitely showing us that nitrogen uptake is temperature dependent and sensitive to temperature. And the colder it gets, the lower the capacity for nitrogen uptake you'll have. And so at these rates, we get the highest recovery associated with the lowest nitrogen application rates. And so, kind of what this is leading us to is like, should we be applying lower levels of nitrogen as the temperature cools instead of a pound of soluble nitrogen? Should these things be a half a pound or a quarter pound as the temperature cools? Because the goal is to get the nitrogen into the plant, from my perspective.
Yeah, I use that analogy or use that example quite a bit where our goal is to get it into the plant. Our goal is to produce a product that our clients, or if you're a homeowner is acceptable. It's acceptable. But there's two sides of the coin. There's the environmental side and the capitalist side and the business side. And in this case, whichever side you're on, or maybe you're in both, it doesn't do you any good to apply nitrogen at a time where there's a very good likelihood that limited amounts of the nitrogen will actually get into the plant, either environmentally due to the potential risk of offsite movement, or economically. You're buying a product and putting it out, and it's not actually being utilized by the plant. So I try to make that clear as often as I can. I don't care if you're a hardcore capitalist and the environment can, go wherever, or you're an environmental tree hugger and you don't care about. On both sides of the aisle here, it's critical to understand that the application of nitrogen is intended to get into the plant, and you're not achieving your goal on either side of the aisle if these rates are going down. So on that note, Doug, and unless you have a point of difference with what I said, I mean, how should we look at these data knowing that the nitrogen uptake is declining as the months get colder? How should we use these data? And let's take a turfgrass, let's take a lawn care operator who's applying fertilizer on an 8-week cycle in Wisconsin or where was this, Missouri or in Wisconsin? So they're applying fertilizer on, say, an 8-week cycle. How do they use these data to be better applicators, to be more efficient with their product?
Yeah, so this is something that a direct outcome from this study is that I think lawn care providers that follow turfgrass research and attend field days and winter conferences have absolutely reduced the amount of soluble nitrogen in their last applications because for the reasons you mentioned. They pay money for that nitrogen, and the goal of that is to get the client to feel like they're getting something for what they're paying for. And what I'm saying is you can probably get the same visual response at a much lower rate, because as you increase your rate in those cooler temperatures, it's not in the plant. And so if it's not in the plant, it's not going to show up as green. You can get that green color with lower rates. And so, if the standard before we did this work was a pound in late fall around the time of Halloween, that was actually literally one of UW-Madison's recommendations to apply a pound of nitrogen around Halloween. Now people are applying, if they're applying anything around Halloween, it's a half pound, it's a quarter pound. And if they're applying a pound, it's going to be near the 1st of October when the plant still has decent uptake.
Okay. Let me understand what you just said. What you just said. I want to make sure I understood you correctly. The UW-Madison recommendations at one point were to apply 1 pound around the middle of October or around Halloween, and at some point in the past, they were that, and now they've been adjusted based upon either this work or other work that you've done or Wayne did or whoever.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So that was if you go to download the lawn fertilization recommendations.
Yeah.
They used to be apply one of the fertilizer about a pound per thousand around Halloween.
Okay.
And now they're modified, and they don't. That recommendation is not there. They're a little bit more nuanced. There's some more options, but basically the last recommended fertilization is at the beginning of October.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there you go. I mean, that's science being applied right there. And the reality is, I mean, how many lawn care operators have raised Cain because the turf isn't looking good because they've reduced the rate, in October. They could apply 1 pound. Now they can only apply whatever, half a pound or quarter pound. I doubt there's many people that are actually observing a significant reduction, if any reduction at all in terms of the quality.
No, and actually lawn care operators are very receptive to this because they're not sure that client's going to be a customer of theirs in the spring. So let's say, this nitrogen is just going to hang around the soil. This is an argument I've heard against what I'm recommending here is to say, well, the nitrogen's not, it's just going to hang around in the soil. It's not going to go anywhere, and it's just going to help the lawn get a head start the next spring. Well, that may be true, but for lawn care customers, only a certain amount of them are going to renew. So why would you be fertilizing, for something that's going to happen next year to someone you're not sure is going to be your customer? So let's focus on being efficient with the nitrogen that we're going to get into the plant this season while they're your customer.
Well, the extreme capitalist position on that would be sod production. I mean, you can talk sod production all day long, but at the end of the day, they're going to harvest that and they're going to offsite it and plant it somewhere else. So why would a sod producer put down a pound and a half of soluble nitrogen a week before they harvest it? It's the same sort of concept as what you're talking about. That that's going to be harvested and taken away. You don't need to necessarily apply it because you're not going to get the benefit out of that application from, like I said, an extreme situation where that's going to be harvested. Well, in this case, we didn't know that nitrogen wasn't really going to be used. We don't know whether our customers are actually going to stay with us all the way through the winter and then re-up in whatever March or April. We don't know that. Well, if I'm not going to see any major deleterious effects from reducing the nitrogen, why not? I guess is that fair to say? Let's reduce it.
Absolutely.
I would also, and we're going to get into the environmental consequences at some point if I ever get through these papers, but just because it's sitting there, we don't know if it's going to stay there. And maybe in Wisconsin soils, I don't know the soils in Wisconsin, maybe it will stay there. But the risk of waiting and applying the nitrogen, say in March or April, whenever you would normally apply your spring fertilizer, instead of just doing it in the fall. You have zero risk of environmental impairment if you wait till the spring versus having that nitrogen in the soil the entire time during the winter. Who knows what could happen, right? It could thaw, it could rain, it could wash out. Who knows what could happen in terms of the environmental fate of that nitrogen. But when you don't apply it, you don't have any risk. So just wait. And there's papers I'm going to go over where it shows that the spring application of that nitrogen is going to result in a very similar effect as the spring response to the fall nitrogen if you just wait and apply it in the spring. So whether or not that fits with their logistical schedules and all that stuff is another issue with every operator. It comes a different schedule. But it's difficult for me to think of a good reason to put it down in late fall or winter thinking, well, I'm going to bank that and I'm going to see the response in the spring versus just applying it in the spring. Why not just wait and put it in the spring? Is there an argument against that?
Not in my mind. I think that's exactly it. Is there in agriculture? You can imagine that access to the field could be limited in the spring. It's a situation that just doesn't really happen in turf.
Sure.
And so apply the nitrogen when you need it. We have lots of opportunities to get out there, and every year's a little bit different. So I don't like making applications 6 months from 3 months from when I think I might need the nitrogen. And I'll give you a little spoiler. In the field study, we did track the recovery, and your highest potential for uptake is on day 1. And every day that goes by, you get less and less of that nitrogen, and that holds true over the winter. So it's not like it's just locked away in a safe waiting to be taken up in April. Mm-hmm. It's actually, some is taken up in April. It's a tiny, tiny amount. And the vast majority of that nitrogen that we apply in November never gets recovered. I think our field results were 10% or something of nitrogen we applied was ever found in the plant. So again, much lower than what we're seeing here. We're seeing pretty good recovery after 10 days under absolutely idealized conditions. Yeah. When we do it in the field, we see the same trends, but we see much lower recoveries, even in the September rates.
Well, I will pull that paper and see what I don't have it on my list to talk about, so I'll pull it and put it on the list for sure. Let's wrap this whole thing up with your conclusions. And as I've said before, these aren't quite as strong as some other authors. This is a little bit more like what I would probably write. Okay. But I like conclusions that take the science, kind of sum it up in a layman's sort of practical use. And there's basically what you did here. Let me just read it. And then if you have anything you want to add to it, feel free to stop me. The conclusions are: our results suggest that some of the widely held views on the importance of fall fertilization may not be as well understood as thought. The in-uptake capacity of creeping bentgrass, annual bluegrass, and Kentucky bluegrass declines substantially as temperatures decrease, although in-uptake potential appears to be relatively high near the time after shoot growth stops. Waiting after this period greatly reduces in-uptake potential. Because of the increased risk of in-loss during the fall in humid temperate climates, resulting from seasonal high rates of precipitation and low rates of ET, agronomic recommendations for late fall fertilization need to be reevaluated. So in short, you're saying what we've talked about is that you're not really, I mean, there's not a whole lot of evidence really to apply these high soluble rates late in the fall, early in the winter, for various reasons. And that our previous, recommendations probably weren't as sound as we thought, and we need to make changes to them. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is nuanced, right? We did see that when grass isn't growing, when you don't get a growth response in mid-October, you do get good nitrogen uptake, right?
Yeah.
And so there does appear to be maybe a special window where you can do some positive things with your fertility. So we're absolutely not saying don't fertilize late in the season. We're saying don't put down a pound of fertilizer long after the grass has stopped growing.
Exactly.
Right. Which I think most people would say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But like I said before, that was literally our recommendation before this paper was made. We did some work in the field, which I think the last sentence of this paper says additional field research is required.
Yeah.
Boy, I wish more people would do more field work because there's a lot to be done out there. There's a lot of different environments. There's different types of fertilizer. This is just soluble fertilizer, or slow release out there. I mean, you could spend half a career just working on cool temperature uptake of nitrogen from a variety of different angles.
Yeah, some of the work out of Virginia and Rhode Island, Connecticut area that show applications in the late fall might have a growth response as well as a color response. But as you move into Wisconsin, into the more, into Iowa and Wisconsin where it's much colder, those same months, you see a color response, but not a growth response. And then you move over into Washington, you see something, more similar to, the Carolinas and that. So it does vary greatly based upon where the study is being conducted and the turf grasses and the nitrogen. I know you didn't go in this paper over nitrogen sources per se, but you've mentioned several times, don't apply high rates of soluble nitrogen late in the fall. There's other studies that measured the differences between soluble and slow release nitrogen sources, and we'll go into that at some point. I don't know if you've ever published anything on different nitrogen sources, slow and soluble, in the fall or not, but generally we recommend, when I say we, I mean the scientific community has recommendations to lean more heavily on the soluble end sources in the fall, because we just don't see the responses that you need from these slow release end sources. And my guest on Wednesday, his paper shows that very clearly, that even IBDU, didn't really give us the response that we were looking for compared to ammonium sulfate. So anyway, Doug, I appreciate you coming on. This, I'm glad that you found this paper one of the more important papers for you, and that you're happy to kind of go over this paper. I will say that you have many, many more papers that are far more, I think, recognized, I suppose, by people in our industry. And at some point, I hope you have the time to go over. I know with your new position, you have less and less time each day, but at some point, I'm going to get into soil testing, and I think that's certainly an area where you specialize in as well. So, thank you for coming.
I'd be happy to do that, Travis. Thanks for having me.
Well, like I said, I hope this information, people find it useful, and the potential complexities of this scientific language, hopefully we do our best to communicate it in a more easily understood way that you can go to your shop or go home and apply it. The take-home message is probably don't need to apply a whole lot of soluble in once the grass kind of shuts down and stops growing. You might get a little color response, but you can get that from very low rates, or much lower rates than what you might anticipate. But in September, October, the earlier times when the grass is still growing, you're probably fine. Fair enough?
Absolutely.
Okay, guys. Tomorrow's at 10 a.m. Wednesday is at 10 a.m. I have another author coming on Wednesday to talk about his paper he did in Washington. And then Thursday. So basically the rest of this week is at 10 a.m., I believe. So I really appreciate everybody hanging out and watching the conversation. Doug, just hang on just a second. I'm going to close everything out and I'll come back. But thank you all for coming. We'll see you tomorrow morning. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Doug.